From Sydney, Australia, this is episode 3 of Chronic, a podcast about IBD. Well, kind of. Brought to you by Gali Health and written and spoken by me, Luke Escombe. Looking back at my IBD diagnosis at the age of 14, there were so many ways it could have gone better. So many obstacles between me and getting the help that I needed. The first obstacle I'm going to call cultural. It was my British embarrassment at the idea of having to tell someone, anyone, that there was something wrong with my bottom. Please understand, I grew up in a country where we didn't talk about that particular part of the body. That was something French people did, and we in Britain, Great Britain, looked down our noses at them for it. Zut alors, there is something wrong with my bottom, said French people in our minds. We'd never actually met any of them. They lived on the other side of the channel, where they drove around on bicycles with hoops of garlic around their necks and big sticks made of bread. But the point is, when it came to bottoms, our English lips were sealed. Add to that, I was going to a strict religious all-boys private school at the time where the teachers, or masters as they called themselves, I'm not exactly sure what they were masters of the universe, I don't know, but they had a rigid zero-tolerance policy towards farts. This was true. A boy in my class, his name was Francis Ebblethwaite II. I've changed it slightly because the real guy has a profile on IMDb now. He once farted during modern history class and received an hour's detention. This actually happened. Word got around the school. So as a generation of young boys, as you can understand, we learned to hold them in. Now, I appreciate that for most females listening, this kind of practice is just a fact of life. Yeah, so what, Luke? Welcome to our world. But for many men in the country where I now reside, Australia, the idea of holding in farts is not just absurd and sacrilegious, but downright un-Australian. I have known Aussie blokes to start conversations with farts and then say something like, "Crikey, that's broken the ice." Not so much these days. Sydney has been heavily gentrified and the coffee is fantastic. But up in Queensland, the Texas of Australia, you might say, flatulence is still very much a source of manly pride and virtue. Can I tell you a story about Queensland quickly? Do you mind? I remember the first time I went up there with my band, Luke Escombe and the Corporation, on our very first tour. We had a 3 p.m. show at a place called the Royal Mail Hotel in a town called Goodna, which was famous for an incident in the 1970s when the nearby river had flooded and a cow had floated in through the upstairs balcony. That actually happened. We arrived at 1:30 in the afternoon to find all of the patrons of the hotel face down at the bar, unconscious. Upon our arrival, one of them, who looked like he'd just walked off the set of Mad Max, raised his head up from the bar just enough to shout, "You boys are late," and then back face down, unconscious on the bar. We managed to locate the person who had booked us for the gig, who was already staggering drunk behind the bar. He was the manager, and asked him where the PA system was that we'd been told the hotel had, and he led us to a kind of storeroom where there must have been at least 12 sets of PA speakers, all hideously battered, broken, stabbed, shot out, and variously sprayed with beer, blood, and God knows what other bodily fluids. It was like a PA system slaughterhouse. After some rummaging around, I found one speaker that kind of worked. I mean, everything I sang through it sounded dirty and distorted, like a karaoke session in hell. But at least there was some sound, and we set up our amps on this bare wooden stage about 1 inch from the ground in a back room under a tin roof. The air around us thick with the smell of ganja and what I'm assuming was meth. We looked out at the patrons of the bar, a few of whom had now dragged themselves into the back room and were staring at us like angry zombies. I tuned my guitar, don't ask me why, and one of them, the biggest one, pointed at me and said, "We want rock and roll and nothing else." And I thought, great, we're all going to die. Now, I'd like to say that my subsequent trips to the Sunshine State over the years have helped to transform this first impression, but look, let's just say it's still a work in progress. The point is that for me, as a young boy growing up in England under the benevolent but fartless regime of Queen Elizabeth II, the idea of trying to describe the symptoms of Crohn's to another human being was deeply terrifying. So I didn't talk to my teachers about my symptoms. I didn't say anything for 2 weeks, and even as it became increasingly painful to sit down on the hard wooden pews at my school, I just did my best to convince myself that that throbbing pain in my, down there, was all in my imagination. But as any of you know who have had a perianal abscess, and by the way, is the peri in perianal the same peri that's in that peri-peri hot sauce you put on chicken wings? Someone look that up. What do you think? Get back to me. As you all know, if you've had one of those things, they don't just go away on their own. And they hurt like a giant pain in the ass, because that's what they are. And so finally, I couldn't take it anymore, and I told my mum, "Mum, there's something wrong with my bum. And, oh, by the way, I've had the runs for 3 weeks too." And so she pulled me out of school and took me to see our local GP. And here is where we encounter the second mighty obstacle to 14-year-old me getting the help I needed, my doctor. Possibly the only detail I'll need to give you about this man to give you a fairly accurate assessment of his character was the fact that he was famed around Wimbledon Village, where I grew up, near where the tennis is, for driving a black Porsche with the vanity license plate DR1, number one doctor. In other words, this was not a man who'd got a medical degree because he wanted to join Médecins Sans Frontières and vaccinate refugee children in the Sudan. This bloke was in it for the cash, and he wanted everyone in Wimbledon to know about it. And of course, it goes without saying, he was a shit doctor. He sent my mum out of the room, examined me very quickly and roughly, like he was in a hurry to get back to the golf course, completely missed the fact I had an abscess down there the size of a squash ball, and essentially told Mum I was faking my symptoms to get out of school. Now, I often ask myself, why didn't we go back later on and confront this mucousy discharge of a man about his gross negligence and incompetence? Why didn't we, as some of you Americans might say, sue his ass? Or at least pay one of the local youth gang members in Wimbledon to spray paint a giant penis on his Porsche? I don't know. It never occurred to us. There was just too much other shit going on. But let me say it one more time for the permanent record. Doctor number one, in my mind, you'll forever be a number two. So thanks to those two obstacles, my embarrassment about my symptoms and my incompetent GP, it took another 2 weeks for me to get to hospital. Eventually, the pain of the perianal abscess got so bad that I was finally able to overcome my embarrassment and show Mum my bottom. She freaked out and called the after-hours number at the GP clinic, and this time, thankfully, we had a young female doctor come to our house to examine me. She took one look at, the area and said, "Get this boy to a hospital." And so I spent the night alone in the hospital, scared out of my mind, knowing that I was going in for surgery on my bottom in the morning. The first thing I remember after I woke up from the deep, dream-filled slumber of the anesthetic is one of the doctors telling me to go and have a bath, so my surgical dressing would slip out gently in the warm water like a young lily floating upon a moonlit lake. And a scene followed that was like something out of Game of Thrones, with this poor nurse having to wedge her foot on the rim of the bathtub while she wrenched the bandage out of my bum crevice with both hands. I was screaming so loud during this that the room quickly filled up with security personnel who helped me get out of the bath, at which point I fainted. Up to that point, I thought only women in 19th century dresses fainted, so this was a pretty big clue to me that something unusually fucked was happening to me. Initially, I spent about 2 days in hospital, but as soon as I got home, my dressing fell out of my anus and there was blood and shit everywhere, and so Mum put me back in the car and drove me right back to the hospital, where they started in on all the tests to find out what was wrong with me. For a while, because they didn't know if what I had was contagious, they put me in an isolation room, which was actually pretty sweet, because, well, I was a 14-year-old boy, and there's just not a whole lot else to do when you're stuck in bed all day, so I did appreciate having a room to myself. And eventually they did a colonoscopy and diagnosed me with Crohn's disease, which I'd never heard of before except in the phrase, "she's an old crone," so I thought maybe I was turning into Margaret Thatcher. Millennials, I apologise again, old reference. Please Google it. All up, I spent about 2 weeks in hospital and a further 2 weeks recovering at home reading Stephen King books, before returning to school where a strange rumour had been doing the rounds about what was wrong with me. You see, a couple of my school friends had visited me while I was in hospital, and one of the nurses had mentioned in their presence that the gauze they were using to dress my abscess wound with was made out of some kind of seaweed. Interesting bit of trivia, nice little conversation piece. Well, by the time I got back to school, this nugget of information had somehow mutated into the bold new theory that I had been in hospital for 2 weeks because I got seaweed stuck down the shaft of my penis. Word had got around the school. "Did you hear about Escombe? Yeah, he got seaweed in his knob. How'd he do that?" "Oh, I heard he was wanking at the seaside." "Wow, dirty bugger." So the first thing I had to do on returning to school was deny and refute this theory many times. But to be honest, the real explanation of what I'd been through wasn't much less embarrassing. I should tell you at this point that the year before I got sick, I'd been one of the captains of the school. I was in the rugby team, I was in a band, and I'd just won the acting prize after writing and directing my own play. I wasn't just self-confident, I was more up myself than a colonoscopy camera. But my Crohn's diagnosis began a long, hard lesson in humility. I was put on a high dose of steroids that gave me hamster cheeks and acne. I was dropped from the sports teams for being too unfit. I mean, fair enough, but talk about kicking a guy when he's down. I stopped being cast in the lead roles in the school plays. Instead, I was reduced to minor parts like guys standing at the back not saying much. Over the next year or so, I was ditched by my group of friends. No one invited me to their house parties. I missed out on years of awkward teenage fumblings, getting Malibu and ecstasy pumped out of my stomach and vomiting in the alleys behind kebab shops. And instead, I became socially isolated, which is a fancy way of saying lonely. No one in the healthcare system offered me any support, any counselling. No one made any effort to connect with me at my level. My gastro told me at one point, "It's not the steroids making you fat, Luke, it's you." I'm sure he drove a Porsche. And I'm now going to say something that seems obvious in hindsight, but I literally only realised it last year when I saw a Facebook post listing the symptoms of depression. I was depressed after my diagnosis for the next 15 years. Lack of energy, withdrawal, dark thoughts, negativity, lack of physical activity, feelings of guilt, low self-esteem. To quote George Costanza from Seinfeld, I got it all. I was depressed for 15 years. But, the physical signs of my illness started slowly disappearing after about 6 months. My bloods were looking good. The inside of my bowel, as far as the insides of bowels go, I mean, it is what it is, right? It was looking kind of okay again. I was heading into remission. Case closed. Job done. Another successful treatment. I was, to use a phrase I still sometimes hear from gastros today, doing fine. Doing fine. Shit, I even used that phrase myself. I used it mostly as a form of self-defense against my gastro when he'd suggested sending me to see a psychiatrist. I guess in his mind he was ticking a box marked emotional support. But to me, at the age of 14, it just sounded like a threat. I mean, a psychiatrist. That was one wrong answer away from being dragged off in a straitjacket to a padded cell. What 14-year-old kid wants to go and see a psychiatrist? So I said, no, I'm fine. And that became my default answer over the next 15 years. I don't know, I don't think a psychiatrist was really what that 14-year-old me needed. I think all he really needed was some kindness, some empathy, some validation as a human being. And I'm happy to say I finally found that, albeit many years later, not from a medical professional, but from a fellow crony. The very first time I spoke to another person with IBD, so much of my anxiety and shame and guilt just disappeared. Because I realized that what I'd been through, what I'd felt at the time and what I was still feeling now was actually quite normal, quite typical, easily within the bell curve. I wasn't crazy at all. I was just wounded. Then over time, through the love of a very good and very patient woman, I finally learned to love and accept and forgive myself, and that's when things really started to change, and I'm going to tell you all about that in a future episode. For now, though, I want to say thank you for listening to this episode. I'm sorry if any of what I said brought back painful memories for you, whether they were distant memories or all too fresh. If I have any advice for people who've been newly diagnosed with IBD, or if I could go back and talk to my younger self, what I'd say is, hang in there. Don't give up on yourself or on life, because things are going to get so much better. You will find love one day, and you will find a way to live the life of your dreams. And it will feel so much sweeter knowing everything you've been through to get there. My name's Luke Escombe, and my condition is chronic.